Hello, and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr. McDonald. In this episode, I'll be reading and discussing the section of the virtue that makes small in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I also have a discussion of the film Rocky from 1976 to accompany the section. So let's get started. Of the virtue that makes small. Section 1. When Zarathustra was again on firm land, he did not go off straight away to his mountains and his cave, but made many journeys and asked many questions and inquired of this and that, so that he said jokingly of himself, "Behold, a river that flows back to its source through its many meanderings." For he wanted to learn what had been happening to men whilst he had been away, whether they had become bigger or smaller. And once he saw a row of new houses, and he marveled and said, "What do these houses mean? Truly no great soul put them up as its image. Did a silly child perhaps take them out of its toy box? If only another child would put them back into its box. And these sitting rooms and bedrooms, are men able to go in and out of them? They seem to have been made for dolls, or for dainty nibblers, who perhaps let others nibble with them." And Zarathustra stopped and considered. At length he said sadly, "Everything has become smaller. Everywhere I see lower doors. Anyone like me can still pass through them, but he has to stoop. Oh, when shall I return to my home, where I shall no longer have to stoop, shall no longer have to stoop before the small men?" And Zarathustra sighed and gazed into the distance. The same day, however, he spoke his discourse upon the virtue that makes small. So immediately kicking off the section, then we have Zarathustra back on land as he's been aboard a ship for the last little couple of sections. And he comes upon some houses, but of course the houses are so small, they're like doll houses, and he thinks to himself, who exactly can live in these little doll houses here? And the whole problem as well, and the key line from this first part is, "Oh, when shall I return to my home, where I shall no longer have to stoop, shall no longer have to stoop before the small men." And so, of course, this is metaphorical in the sense of Zarathustra is here not talking about actual small men, but rather people who have ultimately a very small view of the world and small mindset, and therefore hinder other people with how they view the world in their small mindset to the such extent they have to stoop and ultimately lower themselves in order to be able to fit inside this dollhouse. And so we have almost quite a comical idea here of someone who's too big and too tall to therefore have the whole problem of, well, this incredibly tall person is going to have to shrink themselves down into somehow being able to fit into this dollhouse in this wonderful sort of Alice in Wonderland like image, because we have that wonderful comparison where Alice herself has the whole bigger and smaller aspect in Alice in Wonderland, and where she has to shrink herself down in order to fit into the door. The same analogy here, of course, we have to shrink ourselves down. The whole problem when we ourselves have to become very passive and submissive towards another person and their very small mindset, and how we ourselves become burdened with their ultimately small mindset and small view of things. So continuing on, and we'll get a better idea exactly what is the problems with this whole view of smallness. Section 2. I go among this people and keep my eyes open. They do not forgive me that I am not envious of their virtues. They pique at me because I tell them. For small people, small virtues are necessary. And because it is hard for me to understand that small people are necessary, here I am still like a cockerel in a strange farmyard, who is pecked at even by the hens. But I am not unfriendly to these hens on that account. I am polite towards them, as towards every small vexation. To be prickly towards small things seems to me the wisdom of a hedgehog. They all talk of me when they sit around the fire at evening. They talk of me, but no one thinks of me. This is the new silence I have learned. Their noise about me spreads a cloak over my thoughts. They bluster among themselves. What does this gloomy cloud want with us? Let us see that it does not bring us a pestilence. And recently a woman pulled back her child when it was coming towards me. Take the children away, she cried. Such eyes scorch children's souls. They cough when I speak. They think that coughing is an objection to strong winds. They know nothing of the raging of my happiness. We have no time yet for Zarathustra, thus they object. But of what consequence is a time that has no time for Zarathustra? And should they even praise me, how could I rest on their praise? Their praise is a barbed girdle to me. It scratches me, even when I take it off. And I have learned this too among them. He who praises appears to be giving back. In truth, however, he wants to be given more. Ask my foot if it likes their melodies of praise and enticement. Truly, to such a measure and tick-tock, be it likes neither to dance nor stand still. They would like to lure and commend me to small virtue. They would like to persuade my foot to the tick-tock measure of a small happiness. I go among this people and keep my eyes open. They have become smaller and becoming even smaller, and their doctrine of happiness and virtue is the cause. For they are modest even in virtue, for they want ease. But only a modest virtue is compatible with ease. To be sure, even they learn in their own way how to stride and stride forward. That is what I call their limping. Therewith they become a hindrance to anyone who is in a hurry, and some of them go forward and at the same time look backward with a stiff neck. I like to run up against them. Foot and eye should not lie, nor give one another the lie, but there is much lying among the small people. Some of them will, but most of them are only willed. Some of them are genuine, but most of them are bad actors. There are unconscious actors among them, and involuntary actors. The genuine are always rare, especially genuine actors. There is little manliness here, therefore their women make themselves manly. For only he who is sufficiently a man will redeem the woman in woman. And I have found this hypocrisy the worst among them, that even those who command affect the virtues of those who obey. I serve, you serve, we serve. So here even the hypocrisy of the rulers intones, and alas, if the first ruler is only the first servant. Ah, my eyes' curiosity has strayed even into their hypocrisies, and I have divined well all their fly happiness and their humming around sunny window panes. I see as much weakness as goodness, as much weakness as justice and pity. They are frank, honest, and kind to one another, as grains of sand are frank, honest, and kind grains of sand. To embrace modestly a little happiness that they call submission, and at the same time they are looking out for a new little happiness. Fundamentally they want one thing most of all, that nobody shall do them harm. So they steal a march on everyone and do good to everyone. This, however, is cowardice, although it be called virtue. And when they speak harshly, these little people, I hear in it only their hoarseness. Every draught, in fact, makes them hoarse. They are clever, their virtues have little fingers, but they lack fists. Their fingers do not know how to fold into fists. To them, virtue is what makes modest and tame. With it, they make the wolf into a dog, and man himself into man's best domestic animal. We have set our chairs down in the middle. That is what their smirking tells me, and as far away from dying warriors as from contented swine. This, however, is mediocrity, although it be called moderation. So the first thing we have then is this group of people then living in this idealistic sort of world and having their own outlook that's all based upon this very small outlook, of course, as Nietzsche's pointing out. And they don't want to listen to Zarathustra, in which, of course, Zarathustra himself is no stranger to people not wanting to listen to him, because we have that straight in the marketplace back in the prologue section. When he first comes down from the mountain, nobody wanted to listen to him there either. But this time, he has this curious nature and analyzes this group of people in the sense of here they have this very idealistic state, and yet when anybody actually tries to show them how things actually are, or try to break the bubble that ultimately they've created for themselves and are living in, they don't want to hear anything of it. In fact, they start to then become very fearful of him, and it's that whole sense of hide your children away from him because he's harmful for us, and that sense of, well, he's going to be going against the whole idealistic norm that's sort of been created up within society that everybody's adhered towards. But then it's exactly what Zarathustra says. Is it something that I myself would want? No, not at all. But they would like to try and persuade me that this is something good. And everybody seems to be, at least on the most part, all quite happy to go about their lives. But I treat it like something that's very harmful for me. It's like a barbed girdle. It scratches you when you try to take it off. It's a fantastic image there. And it's that whole sort of fantastic section where you have then everybody has to play to the beat of the same drum, more or less, that Nietzsche's saying. And well, this is where we start to run into a problem with this whole idea in the first place. To have my foot ultimately tap along to exactly the same beat. And then he goes even more into it, because then he says, well, what's another problem with that? Of course, they have no will for themselves. They're only willed. No people are genuine at all. All of them are bad actors. And therefore, there's those unconscious actors among them as well. As to hear the whole extent of and problem that's also highlighted, that when people have adhered to this specific view, which we're saying is crushed into like this small dollhouse, everybody comes very accepting of this and not realizing that actually, wait a minute, I'm having to lower myself, I'm having to squeeze myself into like this tiny uncomfortable situation. Shouldn't I realize that this is a problem? No. Why is this the case? Because everybody else is seeming to have stooped down and believe this is a good situation to be in and willingly accepting it. Why is that the case? Because nobody is in a position to start to think for themselves. It's that whole relation back into nobody has a will for themselves. And therefore, everybody just believes in this lie, ultimately, that has become so great, so accepted, that living in this cramped up box is ultimately good for us, that then it affects us on the unconscious level, which you then agree with even outside of your own conscious awareness. And so therefore you agree with it even when you don't even realize that you're agreeing with it. And a great example for the way in which things unconsciously affect us, of course, and how we think, and the way in which it tries to affect us to accept it as a norm, is through advertising. And one of the absolute best advertises that tries to affect people on an unconscious level is the Coca-Cola fizzy drinks or soda company, and through all their various different advertising campaigns that they have. And there's a specific interest in one as well when they tried to associate the idea of Coca-Cola with family. And especially we have that as well at Christmas. The very idea of Santa Claus and Coca-Cola all wrapped up together as well. So every time it comes around to Christmas season, you then start to say, well, I'm starting to feel happy, it's Christmas period and so on. You think of Santa Claus, therefore you feel good about yourself and you go reach for the Coca-Cola drink. Why is that the case? Because all this feeling of happiness and Santa Claus suddenly then makes you want to go get a Coca-Cola. Why is that the case? Because Coca-Cola has for many years associated themselves with the very idea of Santa Claus. Interestingly enough, even the very idea of Santa Claus itself and the red suit and hat and so forth is all very much all Coca-Cola influenced, because before that it's all green. And so here we have the acceptance of truth, of this small value, how we should ultimately stoop down and lower ourselves into the acceptance of how we should live into this tiny box. In the same way that the Coca-Cola company is going to affect us in the same level of advertising, the ideology at work here is the thing that's going to be underpinning us and affecting exactly how we think. And what sort of individual do we get out of all this, of course, is this whole passive, submissive, and subdued and conforming, and also that whole relation back again into a lack of critical thinking, a lack of your own development, a lack of any sort of critical engagement at all, because everything's so passive and subdued and so herd-like ultimately, in which we have then a nice relation into herd mentality. How exactly does herd mentality come out of this? Because it has all that relation into ultimately having us be very much in like a sheep-like mentality, subdued, passive. And exactly like Nietzsche says here, he doesn't say herd mentality, of course. He says in the whole idea of servants and only serving somebody else. And we also have this, of course, in relation to manliness, and what ultimately the men become is emasculated because they're so passive and subdued. And so who are the people that pick up the slack? Are the women, who therefore become more powerful through their own viewpoints and so forth, as he says. And we get this whole idea then through being passive and submissive, through that great line that he says, it's ultimately to tame us, to make the wolf into a dog and man himself into man's best domestic animal. And then we also have throughout this the whole relation to mediocrity. So neither wanting either of two extreme situations. As he says, they sit right in the middle, away from contented swine, away from dying warriors. So ultimately, quite happily, just sat in the middle of things, being quite passive and subdued. Neither here nor there is a good saying. And of course, Nietzsche starts to realize this is a massive problem. And using a sports example is quite good here to get into exactly what Nietzsche sees as the problem. Is because if we thought of sports and competitive nature and to strive for excellence within sports, not only within each individual athlete's own striving to therefore have this sense of personal achievement, but also the strength and competition and wanting to win within that, how terrible would that be of an idea if ultimately we got rid of all that and to say, well, actually, no, let's get rid of all this idea of competition, striving for excellence and so forth. Let's all have everything moderated. Let's all have everybody win the game when both sides have scored. I couldn't imagine how more terrible a game of football or soccer would be to say, well, we don't need one team to win over the other. That's okay. Once both teams have scored into the back of the net each, then that's the game. And that's exactly what Nietzsche sees as the problem. This is where everybody has ended up in life at this given point in time, is to accept a very mediocre life in which they're not striving for excellence whatsoever. They have no drive. So therefore, it's kind of interesting here, especially it's such a good example for sports, is that Nietzsche as well wants everybody to have this almost athletic type of mindset for themselves to flourish and to strive for excellence and to get away from this whole idea of passive, subdued mindset. And also, we can have the idea here, thinking on it politically as well. If everyone was passive and subdued, then precisely no political change would ever happen, or any idea of challenging authority, even when it's completely wrong. And that's that whole idea of cowardice here. By being passive and submissive, you're ultimately being cowardly. And therefore, what do we want is precisely brave individuals ready to speak up and speak out against things. And the whole idea would be here, especially a good political example would be, imagine the mindset of just being passive and subdued and completely accepting of the Nazis' treatment of the Jewish population. It would be absolutely horrific. Of course, there's the good argument to say, well, if you spoke up against it, then you're going to be taken away and imprisoned. But there's also the whole Nietzsche mentality here to say, well, isn't it bad to have imprisonment there, because at least you're speaking up against it and you're not just being passive and subdued. So continuing on in the last section then. Section 3. I go among this people and let fall many a word, but they know neither how to take nor to keep. They are surprised that I have not come to rail at their lusts and vices, and truly I have not come to warn against pickpockets either. They are surprised that I am not prepared to improve and sharpen their cleverness, as if they had not already sufficient wiseacres, whose voices grate on me like slate pencils. And when I cry, curse all cowardly devils within you who like to whimper and clasp their hands and worship, then they cry, Zarathustra is godless. And this is especially the cry of their teachers of submission. But it's precisely into their ears that I love to shout, yes, I am Zarathustra the godless. These teachers of submission, wherever there is anything small and sick and scabby, there they crawl like lice, and only my disgust stops me from cracking them. Well then, this is my sermon for their ears. I am Zarathustra the godless, who says, who is more godless than I, that I may rejoice in his teaching? I am Zarathustra the godless. Where shall I find my equal? All those who give themselves their own will and renounce all submission, they are my equals. I am Zarathustra the godless. I cook every chance in my pot, and only when it is quite cooked do I welcome it as my food. And truly, many a chance came imperiously to me, but my will spoke to it even more imperiously. Then it went down imploringly on its knees, imploring shelter and love with me, and urging in wheedling tones. Just see, O Zarathustra, how a friend comes to a friend. But why do I speak where no one has my kind of ears? And so I will shout it out to all the winds. You will become smaller and smaller, you small people. You will crumble away, you comfortable people. You will yet perish. Through your many small vices, through your many small omissions, through your many small submissions, too indulgent, too yielding, that is the state of your soil. But in order to grow big, a tree wants to strike hard roots into hard rocks. Even what you omit weaves at the web of mankind's future. Even your nothing is a spider's web, and a spider that lives on the future's blood. And when you take, it is like stealing, you small virtuous people. But even among rogues, honor says, one should steal only where one cannot plunder. It is given. It is also a doctrine of submission. But I tell you, you comfortable people, it is taken, and will be taken more and more from you. Oh, that you would put from you all half willing, and decide upon lethargy as you do upon action. Oh, that you should understood my saying, always do what you will, but first be such as can will. Always love your neighbor as yourselves, but first be such as love themselves, such as love with great love, such as love with a great contempt. Thus speaks Zarathustra the godless. But why do I speak where no one has my kind of ears? Here is yet an hour too early for me. Among this people I am my own forerunner, my own cockcrow through the dark lanes. But their hour is coming, and mine too is coming. Hourly they will become smaller, poorer, more barren, poor weeds, poor soil, and soon they shall stand before me like arid grass and steep, and truly weary of themselves, and longing for fire rather than for water. O blessed hour of the lightning, O mystery before noontide, one day I shall turn them into running fire and heralds with tongues of flame. One day they shall proclaim with tongues of flame, it is coming, it is near, the great noontide. Thus spoke Zarathustra. And so, kicking off the last little section for 3 here, we have the whole challenge here by, says, the cowardly devils who like to whimper and clasp their hands and worship, and then they cry, Zarathustra is godless, and he turns around and shouts, yes, I am Zarathustra the godless. And so we have this whole part here in which Zarathustra proclaims and therefore affirms his godlessness. Why is this significant? Because it's the whole relation into Zarathustra himself, or Nietzsche as well, saying to people that when you ultimately have an idea that everybody else accepts, that's okay. But what's problematical, of course, is that when people have such a belief in God and so forth, then that gets very much forced upon other people, even if they have absolutely no belief themselves. And so there's this whole sort of conformity to it. And there's this whole hit back against the whole idea of therefore just wanting other people to believe just because everybody else does. And it's more to say, well, people have to find that belief for themselves, and people have to find their own ideas for themselves as well. You have to have all that will come back to them and not have their own ideas taken away from them and their own thoughts taken away from them. And that's that whole point here, as he says, when things came to me, my will spoke to it even more imperiously. That's because it's all that lovely affirmation of somebody's own view and the development of their own belief, and therefore having that critical engagement for their own view come out, and therefore being able to challenge what's put in front of them, rather than just having all that passiveness and submissiveness again. And again, here we have the touching upon exactly what makes small people. He says, you comfortable people. And so here we sort of touching upon the very idea of people, small-mindedness in the sense of their outlook is ultimately people who just focus upon ultimately, let's say, very narrow things like profit margins or wealth and so forth to be ultimately comfortable. It's not focusing on, let's say, the grander, larger things or caring about the larger things, such as the environment, the world, how other people are affected, how people are affected by whatever business model that's in place, and so on. All what they're caring about is just the money. And we have this whole sort of idea of just the fat cats, as they like to say, just sitting there counting all their money and not caring about anybody at the bottom. But as he says here, if you want to ultimately grow a big tree, if you want to ultimately create something that's going to be beneficial for mankind and so on, then you want to strike hard roots into hard rocks, ultimately to say, well, it's to not be comfortable all the time. Sometimes you're going to have to hit precisely hard into things that people are not going to like, and it's going to get hit hard and tough, basically. And it's this whole idea as well, it's such a fantastic image here, that because they're so passive and subdued as well in their own mentality, and they don't take any action, that more and more is just going to be taken away from them entirely. And so ultimately what they're going to be left with is less and less every single time. And it's just the idea about, imagine if somebody had a chocolate bar, but then suddenly everybody around them took a piece of that chocolate bar. It's just going to become less and less and less. And it's the whole idea, well, are you just going to let people just walk all over you? Are you just going to be a doormat? Shouldn't you stand up to these bullies in the first place? What are you going to actually have left for you? And it's that whole fantastic section there about being able to actually will and have the actual relation into determination of your own thoughts and own actions for yourself. And so it's that whole sort of motivation. Let's think for ourselves. Let's be able to act for ourselves. Let's start to problematize the situation that we're in. Let's not accept this box as a norm. Let's start to say it's problematical for us, and let's see other people view it as harmful and problematical as well. And it's sort of that way in which if everybody then managed to have that own affirmation of their own critical thinking and engagement and having that whole capacity to think for themselves, then we have precisely that previous idea completely wiped away, as he says, because that great noontide is coming. So we have again this whole idea that humanity is ultimately seemingly in this state before sunrise, and once we move towards this more self-affirming, life-affirming sort of state, then we can arrive basically at a peak of human existence. And what would that be, of course? That's going to be potentially the Overman or Superman as an idea as well. What's going to be that midday? It's going to be not man themselves, but those people of the future, the Overman or Superman. And so a great movie for this section I thought was the movie Rocky, starring Sylvester Stallone, and here's a little brief summary of the plot from Wikipedia. In 1975, the heavyweight boxing world champion Apollo Creed announces plans to hold a title bout in Philadelphia during the upcoming United States bicentennial. However, he is informed 5 weeks from the fight date that his scheduled opponent is unable to compete due to a hand injury. With all other potential replacements booked up or otherwise unavailable, Creed decides to spice things up by giving a local contender a chance to challenge him. Creed selects Rocky Balboa, a journeyman southpaw boxer who fights primarily in small gyms and works as a collector for a loan shark. Rocky meets with promoter George Jurgens under the presumption that Creed is seeking local sparring partners. Reluctant at first, Rocky eventually agrees to the fight, which will pay him $150,000. Rocky undergoes several weeks of unorthodox training, such as using sides of beef as punching bags. So that'll do for a little brief summary of the plot for Rocky. So that's really what it is in a nutshell. So basically, we have the whole sort of underdog scenario where we want to cheer for the person who has very little chance of winning, but there's still that chance. And it's, of course, in the movie, we have Sylvester Stallone as this small time guy who is to then work his way up and condition himself and get his stamina up and so on, and all the training need to fight a world heavyweight champion. And the whole point is, of course, the spoiler is that he doesn't win, of course, at the end of Rocky 1, but that was the whole point in the first place, was not the actual winning is important, but rather just being able to participate in and actually give the champion a good run for his money in the first place. And so we could see how this nicely relates into the section as well, because it fits into the whole argument that Nietzsche makes about our need for striving and not settling for basically something that's mediocre. In fact, it would be good for us to challenge ourselves, and what better example could it be than within a sports film when you have ultimately the ultimate hurdle to try and challenge or overcome, in the sense of trying to therefore take on arguably one of the top people within the profession in the first place. It would be like someone just starting off on an amateur team and then suddenly being thrown into the professionals. Of course, there's lots of other movies in which that happens, but it's the whole point of having all that passion and strive and determination and wanting to do better in the first place that we can take away from this section, that ultimately enables us not only to better ourselves but also enable us to flourish at the same time. Because every single given time, of course, we can identify what problems there is, how to overcome them, how to ultimately improve our own performance, and so on. So it's all fantastic in relation to our own personal development at the same time. And what don't we want is that mediocrity, is what Nietzsche says. We don't want to just rest on our laurels. We don't want to just be comfortable. We want to be able to push ourselves and challenge ourselves, because that's what enables for our own development. So overall, great section then, arguing for our own personal development and not for us to be resting on our laurels in any given way. Many thanks for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed my discussion of the section of the virtue that makes small in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Feel free to check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/dissectingphilosophy. Feel free to also drop me an email at my address, dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com, and I can be also found on Twitter at I am a Rubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time.